If you have ever paid attention to how power really works, then you know the most frightening thing is not when someone calls you a heretic to your face. The most frightening thing is when they lock you up, look perfectly calm, and tell you that they are doing it for your own good. There is a chapter in the Brothers Karamazov that is built around exactly this nightmare. Christ returns to earth. He has barely performed a miracle. He has barely been recognized by the crowd. And almost immediately, he is thrown into prison. The one who arrests him is not a Roman soldier, not a pagan, not the devil, but one of the most powerful men in the church, the Grand Inquisitor. Then, at night, this old man enters the cell. There is no formal interrogation, no torture, no debate. He simply begins to speak, and the longer he speaks, the stranger it gets, the more logical it gets, and the more unsettling it becomes. Because he is not really talking about some dusty old quarrel inside the medieval church. He is talking about a question that is still chasing us right now. Do people actually want freedom? Or do they really want bread, miracles, and someone else to arrange life for them? Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. In this video, I want to take the Grand Inquisitor seriously. First, I want to make clear what actually happens in this chapter. Then I want to ask why Dostoevsky placed it inside the Brothers Karamazov. After that, I want to look at why he chose to create this particular figure, this old church authority, and not someone else. And finally, I want to bring the whole thing back to the present and ask a slightly uncomfortable question. If you are interested in Dostoevsky, Russian literature, religion, politics, freedom, and that impossible knot tying all of them together, stay with me. I have already made 3 videos on Dostoevsky before this one. One was about how he spent much of his life being chased by debt and loan sharks. One was about the mock execution that almost killed him before it physically did. And one was about why the Brothers Karamazov feels like an unfinished novel. Those videos were about his life, his trauma, and the vast late project he was building toward. This one is about how all of that seems to condense into a single chapter that cuts like a blade. And by the end, I want to turn that blade slightly toward us, because the real question is not only whether the Inquisitor is right, or whether Ivan is too bleak. The real question is why modern people keep praising freedom in theory while handing it away in practice. The novel. Let us begin with the book itself. The Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's final novel. It began serialization in 1880, and the author died in 1881. The story centers on an extraordinarily chaotic family. The father, Fyodor Karamazov, is vulgar, greedy, ridiculous, and utterly without dignity. The eldest son, Dmitri, is impulsive, passionate, and dragged through life by debt and desire. The second son, Ivan, is brilliant, cool, skeptical, the kind of man who has used his intellect so hard that it has turned against him. The youngest son, Alyosha, is gentle, devout, and deeply connected to the monastery, the elder, and the line of faith in the novel. Off to the side, dark and poisonous, stands the illegitimate son, Smerdyakov. On the surface, the plot is about patricide. At its deepest level, it is about freedom, faith, guilt, responsibility, suffering, and whether a human being can bear being human. This is also why the novel matters so much. Dostoevsky is not simply a novelist who tells gripping stories. What makes him formidable is that he gives abstract ideas a human face. When you read him, it never feels as if philosophy is being delivered to you from a classroom podium. It feels as if philosophy has suddenly stood up from the page and started sweating, borrowing money, arguing, committing crimes, and repenting. In those earlier videos, I kept coming back to the same point. In his later years, Dostoevsky was less interested in designing elegant systems than in asking what happens to a person under pressure. Can someone preserve a conscience inside suffering? Will a person run from freedom on purpose? If God is no longer believable, what is left for a human being to live on? The Brothers Karamazov is the final great explosion of these questions. The Grand Inquisitor appears in Book 5. Before we reach it, Ivan and Alyosha have already been talking at length. Ivan is not a cartoon atheist, and he is not a clever man showing off for the sake of sounding clever. His real problem is that he cannot accept the moral structure of the world. He gives example after example of children's suffering. A little girl locked by her parents in an icy outhouse. A child torn apart by hunting dogs. A child crying out to God before sleep. Ivan says that if the ticket to universal harmony is paid for with even one child's tears, then he gives that ticket back. This is crucial, because the Grand Inquisitor does not appear from nowhere. It grows out of that protest. Ivan first accuses the world, and only then does he recite the poem. In other words, he first says the world is not acceptable, and only then asks the next question. If the world is already this broken, then why should human beings be expected to carry freedom at all? And it is in this atmosphere that Ivan says to Alyosha, "I wrote a poem, I want to read it to you." That poem is The Grand Inquisitor. The first time I read this part, I honestly did not think much of it. A poem is a poem, right? How long can it be? Then I kept reading, and realized this is not some short lyrical piece, not a few reflective lines, but almost an entire philosophical novella compressed inside a conversation. It takes real time just to read through it once, and it is not the kind of text that becomes clear on a first pass. The first reading leaves you disoriented. By the second and third, you slowly realize that on the surface, it is about Christ and the Grand Inquisitor, but underneath it is really about freedom, order, belief, authority, and whether human beings can bear the burden of themselves. That is why this chapter cannot simply be glanced at. It has to be opened layer by layer. So let us ask what this poem is actually saying. The story is set in 16th century Seville. That setting matters. 16th century Spain was one of the hardest centers of the Catholic world. The Inquisition existed to root out heresy, secure religious order, and reinforce the alliance between church and crown. Put more bluntly, it was a system that bound faith, politics, law, and fear together into one structure of pressure. Ivan chooses this setting very deliberately. He is not just picking a dark place for atmosphere. He is choosing a stage where the conflict between freedom and order can take on its clearest form. In the poem, Christ returns to earth. He does not first announce himself. He does not step forward with a sermon. He simply appears, and the crowd recognizes him at once. A blind man cries out to be healed. A dead little girl is brought before him, and her mother begs him in tears. He stretches out his hand, and the girl comes back to life. Ivan writes this briefly, but those few lines do something powerful. They illuminate the direct, unmediated connection between Christ and the people. They recognize him not because doctrine has been explained to them, but because of miracle and mercy. There is a simple line in the text with great force behind it. The crowd is drawn toward him as if by an irresistible power. There is no complicated theology here, only movement and instinct. They see him, gather around him, weep, and know him. In this chapter, Christ first appears not as a doctrinal system, but as living presence. The moment he arrives, every intermediary suddenly looks unnecessary, and then the Grand Inquisitor appears. He is 90 years old, thin as dried wood, but his eyes still burn. He sees what is happening and immediately orders the guards to arrest Christ. The crowd had just been cheering, and now it instantly falls silent. This detail matters. Ivan is not being casual. The people first recognize Christ, and then immediately obey authority. The chapter's deepest contradiction is already on display. Human beings can be drawn toward truth, and then just as quickly pushed back under order. At night, the Inquisitor comes into the prison cell and tells Christ that tomorrow he will be burned like the worst of heretics, and then he begins to speak. Christ never interrupts him. Christ never answers him. The dominant voice in the chapter is the Inquisitor's monologue. He says, "You rejected the devil's 3 temptations in the wilderness because you wanted to protect human freedom. But in truth, you placed on humanity a burden it cannot bear." This is the structural core of the whole chapter. It comes from the story in the New Testament where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. Across the Gospels, the devil's temptations are essentially these. You are hungry, so turn stones into bread. If you are truly the Son of God, throw yourself down and let the angels save you. Bow to me, and I will give you the kingdoms of the world. Jesus refuses. But the Inquisitor says, "You refused too quickly. and you thought far too highly of mankind. So the Grand Inquisitor is not really about medieval church history, nor is it some moralizing fable, nor is it just a strange story Ivan invented for dramatic effect. It takes the temptations in the Gospels and rewrites them as a modern political argument. Who speaks? At this point, we have to pause. One of the easiest mistakes to make with this chapter is to read it as if Dostoevsky himself is simply speaking directly through it. That is not right. But it is also not right to dismiss it as nothing more than Ivan's private madness. A better way to put it is this. Ivan articulates the most dangerous and persuasive doubt in the entire novel, and Dostoevsky does not take the lazy route of making that doubt look stupid. Quite the opposite. He gives it terrifying logic. He writes it so persuasively that many readers do not respond first by refuting it, but by falling silent. Ivan represents the modern intellectual strand of the Brothers Karamazov. He is intelligent, widely read, mentally fast, and capable of following a question farther than most people dare to. He is not a villain. In many ways, he is more honest than others. But honesty has a price. He refuses to cover the cracks in the world with pleasant language, and so the cracks remain in front of him at all times. The reason Dostoevsky can write Ivan with such sharpness is not only literary genius, it is also that he had seen the kinds of experiences that tear belief apart. I have talked about some of this in earlier videos, so I will not retell the whole story here. But let me pull out the parts that matter directly for this chapter. When he was young, Dostoevsky was involved with the Petrushevsky Circle and came into contact with socialist and radical thought. He was arrested, subjected to a mock execution, and then sent to a Siberian prison camp. A man who thinks ideas might transform the world and then suddenly stands before a firing squad and inhales the smell of death does not come back unchanged. Add to that the experience of hard labor among convicts, and it becomes easier to understand why Dostoevsky gradually lost faith in a simple formula that says if institutions are designed correctly, human beings will naturally improve. This is crucial. The Grand Inquisitor is not arguing against social improvement. What it deeply distrusts is something else. The moment someone claims that they know how to make humanity happy and therefore deserve the right to decide on behalf of everyone else, danger has already begun. And that earlier section of Ivan's rebellion is not just background that can be skipped over. It is the key to the poem. Ivan does not begin from political theory. He begins from moral revolt. He says that the suffering of children cannot be reconciled. When an innocent child is beaten, humiliated, and cries for its mother before dying, no final harmony can justify that. Whenever I read those pages, I feel that Ivan's real question is not whether God can be proven, it is whether this world can be accepted. Once that ground starts to shake, the Grand Inquisitor follows almost naturally. If the world already looks intolerable, then the Inquisitor's plan of exchanging freedom for happiness can start to sound more persuasive than freedom itself. And if you place Ivan's poem back inside Dostoevsky's life, you see that he is not just taking a random swipe at the church. Through this 90-year-old Inquisitor, he is voicing something profoundly modern. Human beings are too weak, so do not burden them with too much freedom. Feed them, soothe them, give them something to believe in, place a stable authority over them, and they will be happier. That does not really sound medieval. It sounds much more like every later system that says, this is for your own good, therefore, we will decide for you. That is why Ivan is not just a convenient opposition character. He is more like a stress test. Dostoevsky pours into him the hardest things he does not want to leave out, and then watches to see whether the novel itself can survive them. Why him? Now we can ask the next question. Why does Dostoevsky choose the Grand Inquisitor? Why not a czarist bureaucrat, or a socialist leader, or a professor from the academy? Why this old Catholic churchman? Let us start with the wider setting. 19th century Russian intellectual life was already splitting apart at high speed. On one side stood the Westernizers, who believed Russia had to learn from Europe and move toward law, rationality, and modern institutions. On the other side stood the Slavophiles, who insisted that Russia had its own deeper spiritual tradition and could not simply imitate the West. In between and around them, socialism, nihilism, populism, and revolutionary tendencies were all growing. Dostoevsky, who in youth had once been drawn toward radical thought, gradually came to distrust the idea that if society were redesigned properly, happiness would automatically follow. He did not retreat into a lazy conservatism. He dug into something deeper and more difficult. Why do people injure themselves on purpose? Why do they reject an order that might seem to benefit them? Why, when given freedom, do they still trade it away? This was not a question he alone was asking. After the French Revolution, Europe as a whole kept chewing over one central pain. Once the old order is overthrown, what comes next? Freedom sounds glorious, but the moment it actually enters history, it collides with bread, poverty, class, administration, war, and crowd psychology. Tocqueville, in The Old Regime and the Revolution, had already seen something important. The fall of the old order does not mean the end of concentrated power. Quite often, power simply changes clothes. Balzac, writing The Restoration and the July Monarchy, was also showing how a new order reabsorbs people into itself. Hugo, in Les Miserables, carries the emotional and historical energy of both the Revolution and Napoleon. Yet he also knows that barricades and passion are not enough to solve everything. In other words, 19th century Europe kept returning to the same question: what happens after freedom? Dostoevsky pushes that question further. He suggests that perhaps the real danger is not that order is hard to build after freedom, but that people never loved freedom as much as you thought in the first place. So why put this argument in the mouth of a Catholic inquisitor? Here, both intellectual history and prejudice enter the picture. Dostoevsky often regarded the Catholic Church, especially Rome, as a historical example of Christianity turned into organization, discipline, and worldly power. In his imagination, orthodoxy was often idealized as being closer to suffering, love, and spiritual freedom, while Catholicism appeared more closely tied to administration, hierarchy, domination, and political realism. This judgment is, of course, deeply shaped by his Russian perspective, and not necessarily fair, but it is dramatically effective. If you want to write a character who stabilizes the world by correcting Christ in the name of compassion, then a Spanish inquisitor works almost too well. And the choice of 16th century Seville matters for the same reason. This is not just a dark mood setting. It is a place where religious fervor, state violence, and public spectacle all exist together. Church, court, execution, ritual, and mass obedience are all on the stage at once. A man who openly says that people are not fit for freedom belongs there as both a historical figure and an ancestor of modern administrators. So, the Grand Inquisitor is not really returning to the Middle Ages to tell an old story. It uses an old shell to speak a 19th century problem, and that problem did not stop in the 19th century. It continued into the 20th, and it has not left us now. You could even say that the chapter compresses several 19th century anxieties into one voice. There is religious anxiety. Is there still room for God? There is political anxiety. Has post-revolutionary Europe really become freer, or simply more efficient at managing people? And there is mass anxiety? What do ordinary people actually want? Dostoevsky twists all three into a single rope, and places that rope in the hands of an old man speaking in a prison cell. 3 temptations. Now we arrive at the true center of the chapter. What exactly does the Inquisitor say? He says that Christ refused the devil's 3 temptations, and that each refusal condemned humanity to unnecessary suffering. First comes bread. The Inquisitor says that Christ could have turned stones into bread and drawn people after him that way, but he refused. He preferred to offer them heavenly bread instead of first solving earthly hunger. He thought people would love him for freedom, while most people care first about survival. The meaning here is very clear. Human beings follow the one who gives them bread far more readily than the one who gives them freedom. The Inquisitor is almost saying that whoever controls material security comes closest to ruling the soul. This is not simply cynical, it is an argument about the structure of human life. A hungry person, a person whose existence is unstable, is not in a strong position to love freedom first. Freedom is expensive. Hunger is immediate. And the text itself grows out of this. The Inquisitor keeps repeating the same essential claim. Human beings are weak, humble, unable to endure hunger, and even less able to endure hunger while also making spiritual choices for themselves. He is not crudely saying that people deserve nothing but food. He is saying that without some stable ground of existence, freedom is very hard to love sincerely. If you force most people to choose between bread and freedom, sooner or later they will surrender freedom. This is why the passage is so often discussed. It is not merely a religious point, it is a political one. In any society where large numbers of people lack basic stability, freedom starts to look like a luxury item. Not because they are unworthy of it, but because hunger pushes the mind toward urgent, short-term, survival-driven choices. What the Inquisitor understands here is the material condition of freedom. And he is not speaking only of food. He goes further and says that people will gladly hand their freedom over to whoever solves the bread question for them. This is where a crucial distinction appears. The Inquisitor does not deny that bread matters. Dostoevsky does not deny it either. Bread does matter. The question is whether anything remains beyond bread. If people obey simply because they are fed, does freedom eventually become nothing more than an empty word? Then comes miracle. The Inquisitor says that Christ refused to throw himself from the temple and let angels catch him. He refused to overwhelm people with a decisive miracle that would have secured universal obedience. He wanted people to choose him freely. But the problem, says the Inquisitor, is that human beings do not like living in uncertainty for very long. They want something bright enough, unquestionable enough, to destroy doubt on their behalf. There is a line in the chapter to the effect that people seek miracle more eagerly than freedom. It wounds because it recognizes something very real. Doubt is painful. The absence of ultimate guarantees is even more painful. To ask people to judge for themselves, to carry responsibility for themselves, to live in ambiguity, is exhausting. A spectacular miracle, a complete narrative, a voice speaking with total certainty, all of these feel like relief. Judgment stops. Anxiety pauses. And this part is very subtle. Miracle is not just a theological term here. It represents every form of certainty that allows people to stop paying the cost of judgment. Why do people become attached to signs, or absolute stories, or voices that radiate total confidence? Because freedom is tiring, thinking is tiring, uncertainty is tiring. The Inquisitor understands that fatigue. So when he says that people pursue miracle, he is not simply mocking the masses as foolish. He is pointing out that human beings find it very difficult to live for long without final guarantees. To keep judging, choosing, reflecting, failing, and beginning again inside freedom is painful. Miracle has one enormous advantage. The moment it appears, thought can stop. And finally comes authority. This is the most dangerous of the three, and in some ways, the most modern. The Inquisitor says that what people want to escape is not suffering itself, but the burden of choosing. Give them freedom, and they become anxious, they become frightened, they fight each other. Then they go looking for someone stronger to obey. Because the heaviest part of freedom is not permission, it is consequence. Authority offers not only order, but a way to outsource responsibility. Hand yourself over, and you no longer have to carry your own life every moment. But this is also why the Inquisitor is not merely a crude tyrant. He does not say, I want to dominate people because I enjoy domination. He says, I see that human beings are weak, and so I will carry the weight of freedom on their behalf. That is what makes him formidable. Despotism is no longer just naked force. It becomes rule in the language of care. It says, enough suffering, let me decide for you. It even says, I do this out of mercy. There is one idea here that deserves extra attention. The Inquisitor says that once we take freedom from them, they will thank us for it. That is perhaps the most chilling part of all. He does not imagine himself as a villain. He imagines himself as a realist, even as a benefactor, as the man courageous enough to face human weakness honestly. In his eyes, Christ is too idealistic, too indifferent to reality, too flattering toward mankind. That means the Inquisitor does not tempt us by wearing the costume of evil. He tempts us by wearing the costume of responsibility, maturity, practicality, and compassion. And that is why the Grand Inquisitor is so frightening. It does not merely present a bad man. It presents a coherent mind, one that can even sound humane. Its horror lies not in absurdity, but in how smooth the reasoning feels. Cost of freedom. At this point, we cannot stop at saying that the Inquisitor is dangerous. We have to ask what Dostoevsky himself is doing with freedom. In those earlier videos, this question kept surfacing. In the one about debt, we saw how intensely he understood shame and the warped inner life of people crushed by circumstance. In the one about the mock execution, we saw why the intensity of standing close to death remained with him so strongly. In the one about the Brothers Karamazov as an unfinished project, we traced the three paths represented by Alyosha, Ivan, and Dmitri. So by now, the pattern becomes clearer. Dostoevsky never portrays freedom as a cheerful, effortless, self-justifying gift. He knows that freedom is expensive, and not in the sentimental way brochures describe it. In Notes from Underground, the underground man already says something close to this. Human beings do not always rationally pursue their own best interests. Sometimes they deliberately act against themselves simply to prove that they are not piano keys, not machines that make the right sound when pressed correctly. This kind of self-damaging freedom looks absurd, but it proves something important. People do not want to be reduced to arrangement. Yet refusing arrangement does not mean you actually know how to live. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov embodies another version of the problem. He thinks he can step beyond ordinary morality, thinks freedom means standing above the rule, and is then slowly destroyed by conscience and shame. Freedom is not just doing what you want. It is whether what you do comes back to live inside your heart afterward. In Demons, the question appears again in political form. There, ideas and freedom detached from conscience and limit rapidly slide into collective madness. You think you are liberating humanity, but end up pushing people into another structure where they are managed, used, and sacrificed. In other words, Dostoevsky had long been writing about the fact that freedom never stands lightly in sunshine. It is always entangled with responsibility, guilt, chaos, the urge to destroy, and self-deception. In The Grand Inquisitor, he raises this to the highest level. What makes freedom so difficult is not only the possibility of making mistakes, it is that you must choose the good yourself, bear evil yourself, face uncertainty yourself, and endure a world without guaranteed miracles and without anyone standing behind you to catch you. Freedom here is not a prize certificate. It is a heavy human capacity. That is why the Inquisitor's argument has such seduction. He identifies the most humiliating truth about freedom. Freedom is not only dignity, it is anxiety. It means nobody else decides for you. It means you cannot hand everything over to God, the state, the church, the leader, the system, the algorithm, or any larger structure. At some point, you still have to return to yourself and ask, what do I choose? What do I bear? What do I live by? Does Dostoevsky therefore conclude that human beings are unworthy of freedom? No. His anguish lies precisely here. He knows freedom causes suffering, and still refuses to hand it over to the Inquisitor. That is why the ending matters so much. The Inquisitor finishes his long speech. Christ does not argue. He simply steps forward and gently kisses the old man. That kiss is not just a sentimental message that love conquers all. Its meaning is deeper than that. Christ refuses to turn freedom into yet another form of coercion. The Inquisitor uses logic to prove that humanity cannot bear freedom, but Christ does not answer with stronger logic that crushes him in return. Freedom cannot be founded on compulsion. You can demonstrate the usefulness of order. You can demonstrate the attraction of miracle. You can demonstrate the necessity of bread. But you cannot force someone into being free by proving them into submission. Freedom can only be summoned. It cannot be replaced. And the kiss matters for another reason. It does not count as victory. The Inquisitor is not converted. He does not fall to his knees. He does not suddenly repent. He simply falls silent for a moment, then opens the door and says, "Go, and do not come again." That ending is extraordinary, because it does not resolve the contradiction. Love appears, but the institution remains. Truth appears, but authority does not collapse overnight. Dostoevsky does not offer a fairy tale ending. He only shows that faced with this logic, Christ refuses to answer with a larger logic of domination. Instead, he leaves behind a gesture that does not obey the grammar of power. Still here. So why is the Grand Inquisitor still discussed more than a century later? It is not because readers suddenly developed a hobby for medieval inquisitions. It is because the chapter names a dilemma that has not disappeared. Everyone says they love freedom, but when freedom arrives, uncertainty arrives with it. Responsibility arrives with it. Choice pressure arrives with it. Judgment fatigue arrives with it. The consequences of being wrong arrive with it. And that is when the Inquisitor's three offers begin to look tempting again. Bread, miracle, authority. Bread today is not necessarily literal bread. It also means security, stability, predictability, material reassurance. Miracle is not necessarily supernatural spectacle. It can mean any absolute answer that relieves us of doubt, and authority hardly needs translation at all. The more complicated the world becomes, the easier it is for people to go searching again for a voice they can obey. Someone else can make the judgments. Someone else can assign direction. Someone else can identify enemies and friends. Even one's anxiety seems lighter when handed upward. What makes the Grand Inquisitor so disturbing is that it is not really about how terrible other people are. It is about a tendency that can appear in any of us. People may not actually love freedom itself. Very often, they only love the sound of freedom. But the moment freedom demands that you bear consequences, make your own judgments, and live in a world without final guarantees, a lot of people begin to miss the Inquisitor. That is why the chapter never grows old. It is not describing a mistake unique to one historical period. It is describing a transaction that keeps returning. You trade a little freedom for a little stability. Then you trade a little doubt for a little certainty. Then you trade a little responsibility for a little comfort. And one day you realize that freedom was not suddenly taken from you. You handed it over, piece by piece. So let us return to the opening question. Do people want freedom, or do they want bread, miracle, and authority? Dostoevsky offers no cheap answer. He does not say that strong enough faith solves everything. He does not say the Inquisitor is simply talking nonsense. What makes this chapter great is that it gives real weight to both sides. Bread matters. Miracle is seductive. Authority can feel like relief, but freedom still cannot be cancelled because of that. The moment human beings no longer choose for themselves, bear for themselves, and confront good and evil for themselves, what looks like stability becomes only a more manageable form of submission. When I first read this chapter, my strongest reaction was not that religion is complicated. It was that Dostoevsky understands with painful clarity how badly people want to avoid inner effort. Not laziness of the body, but laziness of the soul. We want someone else to think for us, choose for us, and carry the cost for us. But if we really step into that arrangement, what we lose is not only inconvenience, we lose part of what makes a human being human. And that, in the end, is why the Grand Inquisitor is not really about the Church, or Russia, or even just a conversation between Ivan and Alyosha inside the Brothers Karamazov. It is about one of the most awkward and least admitted secrets of modern life. People praise freedom with their mouths, but very often what they love in their hearts is the chance not to carry it themselves. Today's video ends here. If you enjoyed today's video, remember to like and subscribe. See you at the next lighthouse.